Cypher here. I've got a weird one today. Newsies is a musical about the 1899 Newsboys strike, and a suitably accurate one for a musical. Who would have thunk it? A musical based on a true story that is actually good historically. Well, it does have some glaring flaws. In fact, it gets nearly every easily verifiable fact wrong. But it being a musical more than makes up for the problems. Maybe it's just because I love musicals, at least good ones. But I can forgive most narrative problems when people are dancing and singing about, like they totally did back in 1899. But there are some things this musical could have done to improve itself a little, and not detract from the movie as a product. Despite that, it is fun enough to recommend, especially if you want to see something about labor history, which Hollywood is sorely missing. Considering this musical is still being performed, it would be nice to see them modify the script, because it would just take a few little tweaks to not perpetuate some of these falsehoods.
You shut up and listen to me for once!
During the 19th and early 20th century, it was a common practice of newspapers to not try to sell subscriptions, but have people hawk the newspapers in public by shouting the headlines. It isn't common any longer since we have vending machines and whatnot, but for more than a century, these news hawkers could be heard much like medieval town criers calling out, "Extra, extra, read all about it!" Sometimes they would sensationalize the news a little to make more money.
Extra, extra! Ellis Island in flames! Big conflagration!
Hey, what? Wait, where's that story?
Thank you, sir. Page 9. Thousands flee in panic!
You lady trash fire next to immigration building terrify seagulls?
A colorful group of children were commonly employed as such, called newsboys. Many were orphans, or from poor walks in life. Since they'd be arrested for truancy, they would sell evening newspapers. Two of the evening newspapers in New York were the Evening Journal, run by William Randolph Hearst, who was the subject of Citizen Kane, by the way. The other one was the Evening World, ran by Joseph Pulitzer, who is the main villain of this movie. Hearst and Pulitzer were also famous as yellow journalists, which I talked about in the Citizen Kane episode, but in either case, they pushed the US into war with Spain. Since this helped sell more newspapers, they raised the fee they charged the newsboys from 50 cents a 100 newspapers to 60 cents. Newsboys lost profit. By the time the war was over, Pulitzer and Hearst refused to bring down the war pricing. After a couple of months, the newsboys went on strike by boycotting the Evening Journal and World.
One thing for sure. If we don't sell papes, then nobody sells papes. Nobody comes through those gates till they put the price back where it was.
What do you mean, like a strike?
Yeah, like a strike.
Instead resorting to other newspapers like the Evening Telegram. They fought off strikebreakers who would try to sell papers anyways. These kind of strikebreakers are called scabs. They stopped scabs by physical means, literally beating them. Hearst and Pulitzer employed people to fight the children in the streets. These fights broke into what newspapers called at the time a merry war. The strike eventually formed a union under the leadership of a Louis Ballot, known at the time as Kid Blink. They would throw several large rallies, make blockades and human chains to stop scabs, send out roving gangs of boys to destroy newspaper carts, and the protest even began to have sympathetic strikes in a number of other cities. This effectively stopped circulation of the Evening World and Evening Journal for 3 weeks.
But since the strike, your circulation's been down 70%. Every day, you're losing thousands of dollars just to beat us out of one lousy tenth of a cent.
Despite Hearst and Pulitzer wielding their considerable influence to try to break the strike, even having many of the newsboys beaten and jailed in what were called the tombs, they eventually compromised. They did not lower the fee for newsboys, but they did allow them to return what they couldn't sell. The strikers went back to work, despite the union saying the strike would continue. There would be other strikes in later years. One of them even made it to the Supreme Court in the 1944 case of National Labor Relations Board v. Hearst Publications. The NLRB represented the newsboys, and successfully argued that the newsboys were in fact employees of Hearst's, and could therefore collectively bargain. As such, newsboy strikes were far less frequent. This was actually a pretty insignificant strike prior to 1992, when the movie was released. As such, there really wasn't any secondary sources to go off of. Essentially, this is one of those that only really existed in local lore. The first historian to write about the Newsies in general had a fleeting chapter on it in 1985, and that is the book the musical is based off of. There is a more recent book, but obviously the movie couldn't use a book chapter written a decade after its release. I couldn't even get a hold of these books, so I had to do a bunch of primary source research myself. Luckily, there's stuff online now, so you can see that this is an obscure enough subject to kinda get away with whatever it might get incorrect. Yet, where there isn't historians' writings, there is always people mythologizing. So the 1899 newsboy strike has become somewhat legendary, and there were a lot of people angry about the musical's inaccuracies, despite the fact that no one had done the necessary research to debunk anything. As a result of this lack of scholarship on the subject, this movie gets every facet of the story incorrect. That being said, I'll get into why the inaccuracies are forgivable later. The movie revolves around a kid named Jack Kelly. He's the strike leader in this, even though Kid Blink is a background character. You can tell by the eye patch. What's even weirder is that this Jack character goes through many of the same troubles as Kid Blink, such as escaping being put in the tombs, and at one point becoming a scab.
What's he doing? But he's dressed like a scabber. Jack?
So why not just switch the character to being the lead? Well, one problem was that Kid Blink was so named because of his eye patch that he wore. It may have been a trick to get people to buy papers from him.
Are you all right? I'm your last paper lady.
You are good.
But that would make dancing a little bit difficult. Plus, Kid Blink was much younger than Kelly is in this movie, and he was constantly mocked in print for speaking too much like a New York hoodlum. Though I will say that he had no want to go to Santa Fe, but we can pretend.
Santa Fe, are you there?
The whole reason for the strike in this musical is completely wonky. They mention the Spanish-American War a couple of times, but act like it is just something that happened in the past, rather than being the inciting incident.
Last year I covered the war in Cuba, charged up San Juan Hill with Colonel Teddy Roosevelt. That was a very important story. Is the Newsies strike important? It all depends on you.
Instead, the movie makes it sound like it was some conniving plan to make money by Pulitzer.
What do the Newsies pay now? 50 cents per 100 papers? If you raise it to,
A mere tenth of a cent per paper.
multiplied by 40,000 papers a day.
It definitely adds up, sir.
What's worse is that this is a plot hole. Pulitzer in the movie makes this plan to be able to handle the competition he's getting from Hearst.
If you do this, every newsie we've got will head straight for Hearst.
But then he just says that Hearst will follow suit.
Businessmen, we often see eye to eye on certain things. If we do it, then the other papers will do it.
Why just say that it's about the war? It's just another change that they could do and not hinder the musical in the slightest. The reasoning for the price hike is integral to understanding the strike. It is not as though these guys did it on a whim like the movie depicts. They were well versed on strikes, since they could read the newspapers every day, and it wasn't even the first newsboy strike. There were many before and since 1899. By making it seem haphazard rather than well organized, one thinks these kids were somehow on their own, but they actually hired outside help to run the union. The narrative falls apart when you know why they were striking, but it could be changed if they just said that the price hike was prompted by the war, but perpetuated by the greedy plan of Pulitzer's. By the way, it's kind of odd that they make Pulitzer the bad guy here, rather than Hearst. Pulitzer often actively sought stories that would encourage union practices, while Hearst was about as anti-union as you can get. Maybe they could switch the characters around, but that's not important. The strike itself was obviously a lot more involved. You get the sense in the movie like it was just these kids doing their thing for a few days, at least until the final dance number. But this strike went on for weeks, caused fighting in the streets, and spread to several other cities. There were several rallies, not just one. Gangs of unionized boys roamed the streets, wreaking havoc wherever they found scabs. They also were the first to be violent. You only really get a sense of that in the finale. All they'd have to do is mention that there is more happening outside of what we can see. In the end of the movie, Pulitzer not only allows paper buybacks, but also consents to pre-war pricing.
We beat it!
That is very clearly contradicted by the evidence. The Paperboys Union leadership refused to give up the strike because their demands had not been met. They don't need to go into the intricacies of the union makeup, but did they really have to depict Pulitzer giving in? Instead, they could have depicted it as a compromise, and still make it a tremendous victory for the Newsboys. The Evening World actually wrote an editorial complaining about how the buyback policy was actually more profitable for the boys than lowering the prices, and that every other evening newspaper had switched to that policy. So why not fix that? Finally, Theodore Roosevelt was not at all involved in this incident. It did happen while he was governor of New York, but there were a lot of other things that were far more important. After all, why would a governor deign to deal with some minuscule strike? These strikes were a dime a dozen. Violence associated with strikes was nigh constant in New York City. In the movie, Roosevelt swoops in because kids are being abused by the administrator of the Tombs.
The governor's very grateful you brought this problem to his attention.
But no such thing actually happened. That being said, there really is no fix for that. Teddy is an integral part of the narrative and a nod to his general character.
Disgraceful, Denty. Those poor boys. And I did nothing.
So I guess it's an allowable inaccuracy. This could be a bit better historically, without having to redo the play. A few script tweaks and it would be great, but ultimately, it's a musical. When you start seeing people dancing and singing in choreographed movements, there is an obvious silliness to everything. With serious based on a true story movies, one of the most difficult things is separating fact from fiction. But here, it is a lot easier. There's a principle to judge these films, and it is pretty simple. Does it do more harm than good? If this was serious drama, exposing the plight of these children, so we in the present could learn a hard lesson about how we should treat the underprivileged, this movie would be extremely damaging. Instead, this movie chooses to emphasize solidarity and happiness in a way only a musical can. As such, any inaccuracies have no political edge that rings false afterwards. If you take anything false about this movie as truth, your conception of the world will not be hindered. It is a small enough subject to not interfere with anything else. It is safely inaccurate. Unlike whatever serious movie you want to name. A few tweaks could be done, but nothing major is required. That's not to say that it's accurate. It still distorts the narrative tremendously. But because people are dancing and singing around the place, it's kinda understandable. I don't know why this movie bombed at the box office like it did, but I like it a lot. A musical is a welcome reprieve from the self-serious based on a true story pablum I normally do on here. And just think, it's about the troubles of labor organization. We could definitely use some movies about strikes. It'd be nice to see more of this in the future.